The summer heat bore down on central Texas in the middle of June 1945, where something remarkable was unfolding behind rows of barbed wire fencing. Men who had crossed an ocean expecting the worst treatment imaginable found themselves standing before scenes that contradicted everything they thought they understood about their captors. The thick scent of smoking wood and roasting meat drifted through the compound air, while these German soldiers watched American servicemen carving enormous portions of barbecued beef, portions larger than most of them had encountered in their entire lives. Young Americans darted past, clutching frozen cream treats and bottles of that distinctively American soda, creating a spectacle that seemed impossible to reconcile with their expectations. These were individuals who had been raised consuming the Reich's constant stream of information about enemy weakness and deprivation. Yet here they stood, witnessing abundance that shook their fundamental beliefs more profoundly than military defeat had done. The newspapers across certain parts of Europe had screamed headlines during that period about female German prisoners supposedly being held on American territory, creating sensation and speculation wherever these stories circulated. The actual documentation told an entirely different tale, though, one recorded in official camp records and military ledgers that revealed the truth of the matter. The United States had not transported masses of women across the Atlantic for imprisonment. The overwhelming majority consisted of male soldiers, veterans from Rommel's forces in North Africa, and other Wehrmacht units captured throughout the Mediterranean campaign. Still, the false narrative possessed remarkable staying power, revealing something significant about expectations versus reality. The world anticipated seeing evidence of brutality, deprivation, and the harsh treatment of prisoners according to wartime norms. What actually materialized on American soil defied these predictions entirely, through demonstrations of material comfort, respectful treatment, and food that surpassed anything these soldiers had experienced, even as free men in their homeland. Understanding why this correction matters requires recognizing how deeply the misleading information shaped perceptions. The sensational headlines promised scandal and suffering, but the documented reality offered something far more destabilizing to Nazi ideology. Between 1943 and 1946, American territory absorbed more than 425,000 German prisoners of war, dispersing them throughout facilities that stretched from the northeastern coast down to the southwestern plains. These men lived under careful observation while receiving treatment that adhered to international agreements governing prisoner welfare. Beyond mere compliance with legal requirements, they received regular meals, proper clothing, and often found themselves participating in aspects of ordinary American civilian life that would have seemed unimaginable behind enemy lines. The gulf between expectation and experience became the real narrative, one that proved more shocking to many Germans than any rumored scandal about female prisoners ever could have been. Consider the deep irony embedded in this situation. The regime these soldiers served had constructed its entire mythology around images of corrupt, enfeebled democracies unable to sustain themselves. Before capture, fighting men received warnings about American society's supposed decay, about poverty concealed behind empty propaganda, about food shortages allegedly worse than anything Germany faced. One diary confiscated from an Afrika Korps soldier in Tunisia contained explicit warnings claiming that Americans starved their own population while drowning the world in false claims of prosperity. Yet within mere weeks of laying down their weapons, these same individuals found themselves consuming cuts of beef so substantial they resembled something other than standard military rations. The transformation happened too quickly for many to process. This narrative extends beyond simple discussions of camp menus and dietary provisions. At its core, it examines a contest over perception itself. a battle waged not through conventional military means, but through demonstrations of material abundance and carbonated beverages. It explores how sustained exposure to plenty could accomplish what leaflets and speeches never managed, dismantling the certainty that Nazi propaganda had constructed over years. One prisoner later described his astonishment at witnessing Americans casually discarding items that would have been considered precious in Germany, things like bread crusts, potato peelings, or bacon grease that no German household would have wasted during wartime. That shock represented the first fracture in an ideological fortress that had seemed impregnable. To fully comprehend how a Texas barbecue could function as an instrument of democratic persuasion, we need to trace these prisoners' journey backward to its origins in the North African deserts, through the surrender that stunned military observers worldwide, and aboard the crowded transport vessels that carried them across submarine-infested waters. What they observed during these transitions, and what they would continue seeing afterward, systematically overturned their previous understanding of the world. The dust finally settled across Tunisia in May 1943 as exhausted columns of German and Italian troops marched into captivity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's celebrated Africa Corps had fought with determination and skill, but strangled supply lines, vanished fuel reserves, and overwhelming Allied pressure had made continued resistance impossible. Within a remarkably brief period, approximately 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered their arms. Many anticipated execution, or, at best, brutal forced marches under the merciless desert sun. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks, provided with water, and informed they were bound for a destination that seemed beyond comprehension. They were going to the United States itself. The journey began at North African ports like Algiers and Oran, facilities swollen with Liberty ships that represented American industrial might. These steel vessels had been designed and mass-produced to transport cargo, including tanks, grain and fuel, across waters where German submarines prowled. Now, in an irony that even the American sailors found surreal, these same ships ferried human cargo by the tens of thousands each month. From June 1943 through the war's conclusion, upward of 30,000 German prisoners crossed the Atlantic monthly. Bunks were crammed into cargo holds, barbed wire was rigged across open deck spaces, and guards carrying carbines paced through narrow passages. The smell became something none of them would forget. Salt spray penetrating steel hatches and mingling with human sweat, damp wool uniforms, and the sour smell of seasickness affecting men unaccustomed to ocean travel. Crammed into these spaces, prisoners whispered among themselves with disbelief. They were being sent to America, one man scratched into his diary, to the land supposedly overflowing with milk and honey, or so the Führer claimed, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. Yet doubt gnawed at their certainty. Even within these holds, food trays arrived carrying portions that seemed unimaginable compared to what they had known in Europe. The bread came soft and white, not the coarse, dark varieties they knew. Meat appeared regularly. Butter was spread without apparent concern for rationing. One soldier later recalled how they ate better aboard the transport ship than they had at any point on the front lines, leaving him uncertain how to interpret this treatment. Above them, Liberty ships steamed in coordinated convoys, escorted by destroyer vessels whose crews scanned constantly for submarine periscopes. German U-boat packs continued their predatory patrols despite declining numbers. The prisoners listened to the steady throb of engines, the underwater thud of depth charges rolling into the sea, and the eerie silence that followed when no explosion indicated a hit. Every heavy thump reminded them their lives now depended on the very navy they had been fighting against. The irony was impossible to escape. German soldiers were being fed by American cooks, protected by American sailors, and transported to captivity by the arsenal their leaders had dismissed as weak and ineffective. The voyage itself provided an education in scale and capacity. Prisoners counted ships, observing dozens or sometimes more than 100 vessels moving in disciplined formations. They watched cranes in Algiers unloading cargo and then reloading supplies bound for European theatres. Numbers circulated through the crowded decks in whispered conversations. The Americans were supposedly constructing one Liberty ship every 3 days. For men from a Reich already suffering under strategic bombing, this felt like standing inside an endless factory, witnessing a machine that possessed unstoppable momentum. Yet within those dim, swaying holds, another unexpected dynamic developed. The guards proved not to be cruel or sadistic. They shared cigarettes with prisoners. They spoke casually about baseball games back home, about wives and sweethearts waiting for them, about farms in Kansas or sawmills in Oregon. For many prisoners, this represented their first indication that their enemies were not the monsters depicted in propaganda films, but ordinary individuals wearing different uniforms. One particular sound embedded itself in their memory above all others. The metallic clang of mess trays as food was distributed. That sound, one soldier later explained, became synonymous with America in his mind. It signified that he would eat, that he would survive. But the true revelation still awaited them ahead. Norfolk beckoned with its extensive docks, massive warehouses, and the first glimpses of American territory. From sea to soil, these prisoners were about to learn what abundance looked like when examined up close. The Liberty ship glided into Norfolk's harbour in June 1943, providing many German prisoners their initial view of American territory. Towering cranes like steel giants dominated the skyline. Warehouses stood stacked with goods. Railway lines hummed with locomotive activity, and most striking of all, no ruins, no rubble, no shattered glass. For men departing from bombed-out cities, the sight resembled arriving in a completely different world. The disembarkation proceeded briskly, yet with notable organization. Prisoners shuffled down gangplanks under guard supervision, their boots producing metallic sounds on the steel. What struck them immediately was not hostility from their captors, but rather the efficient, almost business-like atmosphere. Lines of trucks waited in formation. Red Cross officers stood nearby observing. American soldiers carried clipboards rather than prominently displaying their rifles. One soldier later recalled how it felt more like entering a factory than a prison, with everything moving with precision and supplies appearing limitless. Processing began immediately with medical inspections. Doctors wearing clean uniforms with stethoscopes draped around their necks checked blood pressure, examined teeth, listened to lungs. Many prisoners, hardened by desert combat, assumed this was merely a pretext for some form of humiliation. Instead, they were informed about their weight, their nutritional deficiencies, and their various medical conditions. Records indicate the average German POW arriving at Norfolk weighed between 25 and 30 pounds below his expected healthy range. Nearly 1 in 5 displayed clear signs of malnutrition, including night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, bleeding gums indicating scurvy, skin rashes from pellagra, and general weakness associated with beriberi. The paradox struck with devastating force. Men who had marched to war believing themselves to be Europe's elite warriors were suddenly revealed in cold medical terms as underfed and physically compromised. Then came the shock that none had anticipated. Real food, not scraps. Hot meals, not crusts. Milk poured freely without apparent concern for rationing. Bread arrived soft and white, rather than black and gritty with impurities. Meat appeared in portions so generous that initially many suspected some kind of deception. One remembered waiting for cameras to appear, expecting to be told this was staged for propaganda purposes, but no one came to reveal the trick. The food was genuine. Within the processing camps, the menu consisted of standard army fare including scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, beef stew and coffee, gallons upon gallons of coffee. For prisoners accustomed to ersatz beverages made from roasted grain or chicory root, the aroma of actual roasted coffee beans was almost intoxicating. Diaries captured their disbelief in stark terms. "Surely even their soldiers do not consume food like this," wrote a corporal from Bremen. But American soldiers did eat this way, regularly. The psychological impact of these meals cannot be overstated. German propaganda had consistently portrayed America as a hollow giant, a nation unable to adequately clothe or feed its own citizens. Yet here, the enemy not only fed its soldiers well, but fed its prisoners nearly as well. One doctor's report noted that within weeks of arrival, average prisoner weight increased by 10 to 12 pounds, while morale appeared confused, with prisoners laughing as they ate, but then falling silent, as if fearing the food would suddenly be taken away. The processing centers also provided first glimpses of American material abundance beyond just food. Prisoners observed warehouses stacked impossibly high with crates of fruit, tobacco, and even chocolate. They watched trains rolling past endlessly, each car filled with grain, coal, or machinery. The sheer scale unsettled them profoundly. They did not understand how Americans could possess so much while simultaneously fighting a war across multiple continents and oceans. Smells lingered powerfully in their memory afterward. Diesel exhaust from locomotives, pine tar from the docks, and above all else the constant, inescapable aroma of food. To step off a ship in a half-starved condition and breathe in the scent of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread was to experience in one overwhelming sensory rush the complete collapse of a worldview they had held as certain truth. But Norfolk represented only the beginning of their education. Ahead lay long train journeys pulling deep into the interior, through landscapes entirely untouched by war. Fields green with growing corn stretched to horizons. Orchards hung heavy with ripening fruit. Towns displayed shop windows gleaming with consumer goods. If Norfolk had cracked the facade of Nazi propaganda, the journey through America's heartland would shatter it completely. From the Norfolk docks, prisoners were loaded onto long lines of Pullman cars, their windows fitted with bars but still open to outside air. The rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on tracks began the next chapter of their captivity, a journey across the American interior that for many proved more astonishing than any feast they had consumed. The train surged westward, passing through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Through the windows spread rolling orchards heavy with apples, fields carpeted in alfalfa, and barns painted in red and white like scenes from a storybook. The men pressed against the glass, whispering among themselves. Not a single bomb crater, not one ruin, one remembered afterward. For soldiers who had departed from smoking German cities where entire blocks lay in rubble, the sight of towns with intact roofs and children playing freely in streets created a paradox almost too painful to bear. The sounds defined these memories indelibly. The locomotive whistle echoing across hills, the constant rattle of tracks beneath their feet. And between these mechanical noises, the laughter of American families waving as the train passed through small towns. Sometimes children ran alongside the tracks, tossing packages of chewing gum or chocolate bars through the barred windows. A corporal from Cologne later wrote about how he had not seen a chocolate bar in years, and yet a child gave him 2, leaving him feeling ashamed that the enemy's children possessed so much to give away freely. As the train rolled deeper into the southern states, the scale of America became increasingly clear. Endless miles of productive farmland unfolded. Cornfields stretched to the horizon in every direction. Cattle grazed peacefully behind sturdy fences. Irrigation ditches glistened under the sun. For men accustomed to ration cards and constant shortages of everything, the visible abundance was staggering. The United States was not only feeding its enormous army deployed overseas, but also feeding millions of civilians at home while apparently still having enough surplus to waste. One prisoner muttered quietly to himself, "If they can accomplish this, how can we possibly ever win this war?" By late summer 1943, many of these trains converged on Texas. There, under baking heat, construction crews had worked at remarkable speed to raise entire cities constructed of wood and surrounded by wire. One of the largest installations was Camp Swift, near Bastrop, completed in barely 4 months. The camp sprawled across thousands of acres with seemingly endless rows of barracks, guard towers, kitchen facilities, workshops, and even a fully equipped hospital. By autumn, it held approximately 5,000 German prisoners. Camp Swift embodied the American paradox perfectly. Here was a prison that appeared to its prisoners more comfortable than the barracks they had left behind in Germany. Electric lights illuminated the nights. Hot water flowed from taps on demand. Latrines flushed with the simple pull of a handle. Each barrack building featured stoves for winter heating, fans for summer cooling, and mess halls serving 3 hot meals every single day. It felt as if they had entered a modern world they had been explicitly told did not exist, said one German non-commissioned officer. The sensory impressions of Texas burned into their memories permanently. The air carried scents of mesquite and dust. Cicadas produced their droning sound in the heat. Evenings glowed with smoke from cooking fires drifting across the prairie landscape. Initially, the prisoners remained wary, expecting harsh military discipline at any moment. Instead, guards spoke casually with them, sometimes even joking around. They issued uniforms, bedding, soap, and informed the men their work assignments would come soon enough. The paradox tightened its grip on their understanding. Here they were, prisoners, yet treated with more dignity and material comfort than many had known as free men under the regime they had served. They were captives behind wire, yet they slept on mattresses stuffed with cotton and ate portions that left them feeling full. One diary recorded the confusion directly. They were behind wire, but in their stomachs, America felt like freedom. And then came the moment that crystallized all this confusion into something concrete and undeniable. The invitation to participate in an American ritual unlike anything that existed in Germany, the summer barbecue. It was here, around pits filled with hickory smoke and sizzling brisket, that their perception shattered entirely. The 4th of July in 1944 arrived at Camp Swift, with the sun blazing white in a cloudless Texas sky. Cicadas rattled in the trees, while the smell of smoke curled above the barbed wire perimeter. For the German prisoners, the date held no particular significance. It was simply another day in captivity. For Texans, however, it represented Independence Day, and celebration meant gathering for food, music, and community. By late afternoon, an extraordinary paradox was unfolding. Prisoners marched out under guard were about to witness a feast that contradicted every lesson that had been drilled into them by their former leaders. Rows of barbecue pits lined the open ground, each one dug shallow into the earth. Inside glowed hickory and mesquite coals, red hot, sending smoke rising with a sweet and sharp aroma. On metal grates above these coals, enormous slabs of beef brisket, some weighing 12 to 15 pounds each, hissed and dripped fat that sizzled dramatically when striking the embers below. The air carried complex layers of scent, including black pepper, paprika, garlic, and the dark sweetness of brown sugar in the rub. For men accustomed to watery stews and coarse rye bread as their regular fare, the aroma itself proved overwhelming to the senses. A rancher named Buck Morrison, broad-shouldered and deeply sunburned, lifted the lid of a large steel smoker and used a meat fork to spear one of the cuts. The bark had formed crisp and dark on the outside, while the smoke ring glowed pink just beneath the surface. He laughed as he displayed it to the watching prisoners. 12 hours, he announced, his voice carrying across the space, slow and steady cooking. That's the way you accomplish it properly. The Germans stared in disbelief, some shaking their heads. No one prepares meat this way for prisoners, one whispered to another. Yet here it was, undeniable and real. Alongside the brisket came numerous trays of side dishes, cornbread crumbling golden yellow, beans that had been simmered with molasses, potatoes baked until their skins split open, glass jars filled with pickles and large bowls of coleslaw crisp with vinegar dressing. Children darted between tables carrying glass bottles of Coca-Cola that hissed when opened. These sodas cost just 5 cents at any store, but were being distributed free today. The prisoners watched as American families piled their plates high, laughing and singing, even offering food across the invisible barrier that separated them. A teenage girl managed to slip a generous slice of peach cobbler to a stunned sergeant. He wrote later about thinking of his sister back in Hanover, standing in queue for bread, while here they were giving dessert to enemy prisoners. The music struck them next with unexpected force. Fiddles, guitars, and a harmonica's wail. Country music rolled out over the prairie, mixing with the sharp pop of firecrackers and the general hum of voices. Some prisoners clapped along uncertainly, feeling embarrassed. Others turned away entirely, unwilling to display their emotions. But all of them felt the same crushing weight of contradiction, being fed like honored guests while confined as captives of war. The numbers reinforced the shock they were experiencing. In Germany, ration books limited civilians to approximately 2 pounds of meat per week at most, and often considerably less depending on availability. Here, in a single evening meal, men were being offered more meat than their families at home might see over the course of an entire month. Briskets weighing 15 pounds each were being roasted by the dozen. Hundreds of pounds of beef were being consumed in a single celebration. "This is not propaganda footage," murmured Dr. Wilhelm Huffman, a camp physician standing among the prisoners. "This represents their daily life, and it destroys everything we were told to believe." The taste lingered long afterward. Smoky, rich, impossibly tender. Brisket sliced thin with juices soaking into bread. A corporal from Stuttgart recorded in his diary that he could not sleep that night after the celebration. He had eaten so much he felt sick. But more than just physically full, he felt confused and disturbed. Why were they feeding prisoners so generously? They had killed American sons and brothers, and still the Americans gave them meat fit for a feast. That night, as fireworks cracked and burst above Bastrop, and the prisoners lay in their bunks, the memory of barbecue smoke clung stubbornly to their clothes. For many, this represented the first completely undeniable proof that America was not the land of poverty and deprivation their leaders had described. The enemy had revealed its true weapon, and it was not brutality, but rather generosity. Yet this was only one dramatic encounter. The deeper, more persistent shock would emerge not from holiday feasts, but from the steady, unremarkable rhythm of daily life. In the canteens, in the payslips, in the small luxuries that prisoners never expected to hold in their own hands, the truth would continue revealing itself. For all the memorable spectacle of a 4th of July barbecue, it was actually the mundane, daily rhythm of camp life that astonished the prisoners most profoundly. What they observed day after day, written into menus, stamped into payslips, and handed over in small tokens of normalcy, made abundantly clear that American abundance was not a special holiday exception, but rather the ordinary pulse of the entire country. Breakfast established the pattern each morning. Prisoners woke to the metallic clang of mess hall bells and discovered trays set with eggs prepared multiple ways. Scrambled, fried, sometimes boiled, accompanied by oatmeal sweetened with actual sugar, toast spread with butter, and thick slices of bacon. Coffee flowed freely and abundantly, dark and hot. Not the bitter substitute made from roasted acorns that had become standard in Germany. To have genuine coffee every single morning, wrote one prisoner originally from Munich, represented more luxury than their generals enjoyed at home. Lunch and supper reinforced this shocking reality repeatedly. Beef stews thick with vegetables, fried chicken crisp with seasoned batter, loaves of fresh white bread baked on site daily, pies filled with apples, cherries, or pumpkin depending on what season it was. Peanut butter, sticky and sweet and strange, became a subject of particular fascination among the Germans. One diary noted the progression. At first it disgusted him completely, then suddenly he could not stop eating it. Even potato chips, a snack food invented only decades earlier, appeared readily available in camp canteens. Then there was the matter of payment. Under Geneva Convention regulations, German prisoners remained entitled to compensation for their labor. In American camps, this meant receiving tokens or scrip that could be redeemed at the camp canteen. With these earnings, men could purchase cigarettes, candy bars, soap, shaving cream, writing paper, and perhaps most symbolically, ice-cold Coca-Cola in glass bottles. A sergeant, originally from Bavaria, wrote about sitting in the shade, drinking a Coca-Cola and listening to a radio broadcast. He thought to himself, "This cannot possibly be what captivity means." The numbers shocked them as profoundly as the luxuries themselves. The U.S. Army allocated POWs nearly identical rations to its own soldiers, approximately 3,500 calories daily. This compared starkly to German civilian rations that had dipped to 1,500 calories or less by late 1944, where German families stood in lines for hours hoping to purchase a few ounces of butter. Prisoners in America spread it thickly on white bread without a second thought. The disparity gnawed at them constantly, creating a complex mixture of guilt, disbelief, envy, and unwanted gratitude. Even entertainment became part of the picture. Camps offered libraries stocked with American novels, German classics, and even works by Goethe available in translation. Film nights screened Hollywood pictures including westerns, comedies, and sometimes carefully selected war films chosen to avoid giving offense. Music drifted across the wire perimeter constantly. Swing records played on gramophones, church choirs performed, and sometimes visiting bands came to play. Prisoners could form their own orchestras, stage theatrical performances, or paint elaborate murals on barrack walls. For many, the luxury that cut most deeply was simply freedom of movement within constraints. Yes, barbed wire surrounded them. Yes, guards with rifles conducted patrols. But inside that wire, men could walk fields freely, tend vegetable gardens, or even play soccer matches before cheering crowds. In some locations, prisoners were hired out as labor to local farms or sawmills, riding trucks past astonished locals who witnessed enemy soldiers waving like ordinary workers. A guard remembered one Texas farmer telling him plainly, "Hell, those Krauts work harder than the local boys I actually pay wages to." The contrast to what they had imagined was stark and undeniable. Germany's propaganda apparatus had promised them a vision of a decadent America collapsing under rationing and deprivation, a place of soup lines and desperate shortages. But the canteens, the pay slips, the Coca-Colas, and the steady supply of butter and meat all told a completely different truth. The daily shock came not from fireworks and elaborate feasts, but from the casual, almost thoughtless abundance of ordinary American life. One prisoner summarized it perfectly in a letter that was censored but ultimately preserved in archives. "If this represents their normal everyday life, then we have been lied to more deeply than we ever knew possible." And yet, the most startling encounters still lay ahead for many of them. These would come not within the camps themselves, but outside them, when prisoners walked on American streets, escorted but not shackled, and saw with their own eyes the genuine prosperity of ordinary towns and their inhabitants. By the middle of 1944, something truly extraordinary began occurring across America. German prisoners who had once braced themselves mentally for punishment and starvation now found themselves boarding trucks, but not to labor under heavy guard in hidden quarries or remote locations. Instead, they rode openly into American towns. Their destinations included farms, factories, sawmills, and sometimes even civic improvement projects. The paradox could not have been plainer. Men who had marched into war as would-be conquerors were now laborers in the very heartland of the country they had been taught to despise and dismiss. The sights astonished them beyond measure. Instead of ruined cities or breadlines of rationed populations, America revealed itself through neat rows of houses with painted porches, overflowing markets, and children pedaling bicycles with baskets full of fresh fruit. A prisoner originally from Hamburg recalled walking past a grocery store window somewhere in Kansas. There was more meat hanging displayed there, he said, than could be found in all of Hamburg over the course of an entire month. He thought he must be dreaming. Numbers confirmed the scale of this labor program. By 1945, more than 200,000 POWs were actively employed as laborers, contributing an estimated 45 million man-days of work to the American economy. They picked cotton across Texas, harvested wheat throughout Nebraska, felled pine trees in Arkansas forests, and built roads across the Midwest. Payment came not in dollars, but in canteen coupons and scrip. Yet even these represented riches compared to what awaited their families struggling back home in Germany. The paradox of perception deepened with every excursion. These were enemy soldiers, captured combatants, yet they were being greeted with civility and sometimes even kindness from the civilians they encountered. Farmers invited them to sit under shade trees while drinking lemonade. Church groups brought sandwiches for them. In rare but memorable cases, they were even offered home-cooked meals. One Minnesota woman later recalled the scene. They looked so young and tired. My mother simply could not help but give them bread and jam. They thanked her as if it was made of gold. But the shock carried another unexpected layer. The prisoners had fully expected hostility from civilians. Perhaps stones thrown, curses shouted, or at minimum angry glares from people who had lost sons in the war. Instead, they encountered Americans who were clearly not starving, not beaten down by war, but thriving in a manner they had been told was impossible under a democratic system. They were driven past fields of corn stretching farther than eyes could follow, grain elevators rising like towers against the sky, and freight trains so impossibly long they seemed to have no end. The irony proved cruel for these men. While they marveled at American plenty, letters from home painted increasingly desperate pictures of want and deprivation. Rations in Germany had dropped below 1,200 calories daily for civilians by late 1945. Cities lay in rubble from sustained bombing campaigns. Winter fuel had become scarce. Children were fainting in schools from hunger and malnutrition. Yet here in America, prisoners rode through towns where bakeries casually tossed unsold loaves at closing time, where children bought ice cream cones with spare pocket change, and where backyard barbecues flared to life on weekends as if war was something distant and abstract. The cumulative effect proved deeply disorienting. They saw no poverty, no hunger, no despair anywhere they went, one Bavarian prisoner later admitted openly. What they saw instead was a land that lived as if the war did not even exist on the same planet. It was at that point, he explained, that he realized with certainty that everything they had been told was an elaborate lie. Still, suspicion lingered among some. Whispered conversations suggested perhaps the Americans were staging this abundance specifically for their eyes, that maybe all of this prosperity was merely an elaborate show. But each subsequent trip outside the camp confirmed the identical reality. Full markets bursting with goods, busy factories with smokestacks running, towns completely untouched by bombing, families living their lives without fear or want, even the smell of the air itself, carrying scents of gasoline, grilled meat and baked bread, testified to a life too pervasive and consistent to fake. The shock of those excursions beyond camp perimeters exceeded any feast or barbecue celebration. Behind barbed wire, one might reasonably suspect illusion and stagecraft. On American streets, walking among ordinary citizens, the truth became impossible to deny. The abundance was not propaganda created for their benefit. It was simply the ordinary rhythm of American life. And yet, as the war ground inexorably toward its conclusion, and Germany itself lay in ruins, the prisoners understood their stay in America could not last indefinitely. Soon enough, they would be shipped back across the ocean to a homeland shattered beyond recognition, to cities starving, and to families who could scarcely imagine what their sons and husbands had witnessed. By late 1945, the great reversal began across the American landscape. Trains rumbled once more along the same tracks, but this time not carrying men arriving fresh from battlefronts. Instead, they carried prisoners bound for departure ports. From those ports, convoys of Liberty ships ferried them back across the Atlantic waters. Only this time, there existed no mystery whatsoever about what awaited on the other side of that ocean. Germany was not the land of plenty that propaganda had once described. It was a wasteland of bombed cities, hollowed factories, and ration cards that promised more than they could possibly deliver. The contrast between departure and arrival was heartbreaking for everyone involved. In America, a prisoner might have consumed 3 eggs for breakfast, washed down with coffee and a full glass of milk. In Hamburg or Cologne, his family considered themselves fortunate to share 1 egg among 4 mouths. In the camp, he had purchased Coca-Cola or chocolate with his canteen script earnings. At home, his children waited in lines for turnips or watery bread of dubious nutritional value. It felt like falling from heaven directly into hell, one recalled upon first stepping back onto German soil. Statistics bore out their despair with brutal clarity. By 1946, average daily rations throughout occupied Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories, sometimes dropping as low as 800 in the British-controlled zones. Malnutrition spread rapidly, especially devastating the young and elderly populations. Black markets thrived as the only reliable source of adequate food. For men returning from a land where prisoners ate steaks and pies regularly, the shock proved almost unbearable. A diary from a former POW who had been held in Nebraska recorded his anguish. His wife looked older than her years, his children appeared visibly thin, and he could not explain to them that in prison he had eaten better than they did in freedom. And yet, amid all the guilt and hunger and devastation, something else lingered in their memories and consciousness, a vivid recollection of what they had seen and experienced. They had lived within a democracy that treated enemies with fundamental decency, that allowed prisoners to earn payment for work, to read books freely, to play soccer and enjoy recreation, even to taste barbecue on national holidays. They had seen supermarkets overflowing with goods, farms operating without shortages, and civilians living without constant fear of bombers overhead or artillery in the streets. The paradox crystallized with brutal finality. They had arrived as conquerors in mindset, believing themselves masters, encountering a decadent, crumbling nation. They departed humbled, convinced that America's greatest weapon had never been its tanks or aircraft. It had been its abundance, its ease of living, its ordinary prosperity available to common citizens. One veteran summarized it perfectly in an interview conducted decades later. They were defeated twice, he explained. First by American armies on the battlefield, then by the American way of life itself. Some of these men carried this profound lesson into the rebuilding of Germany during the post-war years. Former prisoners returned with a new respect for democratic governance, for fairness in society, for the possibilities that peace could offer. Historians have subsequently noted how the POW experience became a quiet but genuinely real influence in post-war reconciliation between former enemies. They saw a possible future, one scholar wrote, because in America, even as captives, they had actually lived inside it and experienced its reality. The story of German POWs held in America is fundamentally not one of cruelty or deprivation, but rather of profound paradox at every level. Enemy soldiers arrived expecting chains and instead found Coca-Cola available for purchase. They expected rations consisting of bread crusts and instead discovered barbecue feasts. They expected propaganda and instead found daily truth written clearly in calorie counts, weekly payslips, and overflowing markets. In the end, the barbed wire eventually rusted away, the camps emptied completely, and the men returned to their devastated homeland. But the memory endured powerfully, and with it came a lesson that echoed across subsequent decades. America's true might lay not only in bombs or factories, but fundamentally in its ability to show an enemy a different kind of power entirely. The power of material plenty, the power of freedom and dignity, the power of ordinary life lived without fear or want. When everything was said and done, America's greatest weapon in that conflict proved to be not its explosives or its military hardware, but rather its sheer abundance and the vision of life that abundance represented.